Hello and welcome to this podcast series, Free Irish Women in Indian Nationalism, brought to you by the University of Strathclyde. My name is Lucille and this is episode 3, Margaret Cousins. Margaret Cousins, the third woman that we'll be talking about in this podcast series, was truly a champion of women's rights. Not only did she devote her life to securing women's suffrage in Ireland, but also to uplifting women in India, so that by the time she retired from her feminist activities in India, there was a new vanguard of Indian women ready to take over the struggle for their rights. Born on the 7th of November 1878 in the town of Boyle in County Roscommon, she was a natural rebel. From an early age, she rebelled against the constraints put on her as a girl, and believed that she was born a natural egalitarian. She could not understand why she be treated any differently to her brothers. Her politics went against her family's unionist roots too. Reading in her father's papers as a young girl, Margaret took an interest in Irish nationalism and the growing support for Home Rule. Her nationalism and grievances with British power would only grow as she got older. So even as a young girl, we can see that Margaret did not want to conform, not to the gender roles prescribed to women and girls at the time, and not to her family's unionist leanings. Her marriage to the Irish poet James Cousins in 1903 was also far from conventional. She did not accept the traditional roles imposed on women at the time of homemaker and mother. She continued working as a teacher while married, and her husband encouraged her political interests. Together the couple explored movements such as socialism, vegetarianism and theosophy. Yet her interest in women's rights was only awakened when she happened upon a conference for the National Council of Women in 1906. She called this the turning point of her life, the time when she was forced to confront the injustices that she had taken as part and parcel of life as a woman. No longer did she want these grievances to be taken for granted, but she wanted women to fight for their rights. Inspired by the suffragettes in England, Margaret Cousins and her friend Hannah Skeffington founded their own suffragette organisation in Ireland called the Irish Women's Franchise League. They aimed to get women's suffrage on the next Irish Home Rule Bill, which was to be passed through Parliament in 1913. They constantly lobbied Irish politicians. Many agreed with what Cousins and Skeffington were fighting for, but they could not publicly commit themselves to women's suffrage, and when the bill was passed there was no mention of women's political enfranchisement. In response, Cousins and 2 other suffragettes smashed the windows of Dublin Castle and were put in prison for a month. This was one of her last campaigns for women's suffrage in Ireland, and in 1915 Margaret Cousins and her husband James decided to move to India. They were in a bad financial position, and Annie Besant, a friend they'd met through the Theosophical Society, offered James Cousins a job at her paper New India. Of course, we've talked a lot about Annie Besant's work in the last episode, and the two women's work and campaign interests frequently overlapped. Together they founded the Women's Indian Association in 1917, an organisation which worked for the uplift of Indian women. Cousins and Besant wanted to rid Indian society of all the practices that they believed were holding Indian women back. In particular, Cousins saw child marriage as a really barbaric practice, the age of consent for sexual activity being 12 years old for both boys and girls. This motivated her campaign for Indian women's suffrage. As she says, "I was revolted by the slavery and indignity put on womanhood by the inconsiderate domination of men, and there grew within me a determination to do all I could to forward all circumstances calculated to bring women into public and particularly legislative life, so that this evil and others might be rectified." Accordingly, Cousins organised a group of women to lobby the British government in India to include women's suffrage in the constitutional reforms in 1919, just after the First World War, and only a year after some British women had received the right to vote. This proved unsuccessful, but they continued writing and petitioning the British, and the British relented, allowing provincial councils to decide if women could vote, starting a trend so that over the next decade all the provinces granted women the right to vote, though within certain property restrictions. Some provinces even allowed women to stand in the local elections, and this was progress on a scale that even Margaret Cousins herself couldn't have foreseen. As late as 1916 she had commented, "Only in about 100 years we may begin to think about it." In spite of her pessimism, Cousins still continued to work for women's rights. In 1926 she helped to establish the All India Women's Conference. At first the delegates ran campaigns to improve women's education, then widened this to include divorce rights and ending child marriage. Although she continued her feminist activities into the 1930s, including editing the journal Sri Dharma, she decided to retire in 1943 to make way for more Indian women to take prominent roles. As she wrote in her autobiography, "I had the feeling that direct participation by me was no longer required, or even desired by the leaders of Indian womanhood who were now coming to the front. This was truly what she had worked for, to awaken Indian women and to encourage them to go after their own rights. And she did just this. Several of her compatriots in the All India Women's Conference, such as Sarojini Naidu, Amrit Kaur, and Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, would go on to have glittering political careers, driving forward the agenda for social and political change. By her death in 1954, Margaret Cousins had seen the fulfilment of her lifelong goal, universal adult suffrage written into the constitution of a newly independent India.